Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slow, quiet trip back nearly 2,000 years, to a civilization that technically collapsed long before your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents were even a thought. And yet somehow, it still runs your life. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Maybe dim the lights a little. Let your shoulders relax. If you're lying down, adjust the pillow so your neck isn't doing anything heroic tonight. This is history for sleeping, not history for impressing professors. If you're new here, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. And wherever you're listening from in the world, it's always fascinating to imagine how many different places these quiet stories drift into while people fall asleep. Now let's begin. Because tonight we're talking about rules. Not dramatic laws about emperors or wars. But small rules. Everyday rules. The kinds of habits that feel so normal that nobody ever stops to question them. Standing in line. Signing contracts. Respecting titles. Following dress codes. Trusting paperwork more than people. All of these feel modern. But they are, in many ways, extremely Roman. And once you notice it, you start to see Rome everywhere. Even when you're just waiting for coffee. Standing in line is one of those behaviors that modern humans treat as natural. You line up at the grocery store. You line up at the airport. You line up at amusement parks, government offices, movie theaters, bathrooms at concerts, and occasionally even to stand in another line. Sometimes people even line up without fully understanding why. They just see a line and assume something important must be happening at the end of it. This instinct feels strangely automatic. But lines were not always normal. In many ancient cultures, crowds behaved very differently. If food was being distributed, people rushed forward. If goods were being sold, bargaining happened loudly and chaotically. If something valuable appeared, whoever grabbed it first usually won. Order was optional. Then came Rome. Rome did not trust crowds. Crowds were dangerous. Crowds were unpredictable. Crowds could turn into riots. And Rome absolutely hated riots. The Roman solution was surprisingly simple. Organization. Not necessarily fairness. Not necessarily kindness. Just visible order. When Rome distributed grain to citizens, which it did regularly to keep the population calm, thousands of people would gather. Without structure, this could become violent very quickly. So officials introduced a simple rule. Everyone waits in a line. A very long line. A very slow line. But a line nonetheless. From the Roman perspective, this was brilliant. A line does several useful things at once. First, it spreads frustration evenly. Everyone is waiting, so nobody feels uniquely cheated. Second, it makes the process predictable. You know where you stand. Literally. Third, it reduces chaos. Instead of a pushing crowd, you have a quiet procession of people slowly shuffling forward. It doesn't actually make distribution faster. It just makes the waiting feel structured. And humans tolerate structured suffering far better than chaotic suffering. Rome understood something about psychology that still applies today. People accept inconvenience more easily when it looks organized. And so the Roman line became a social ritual. It appeared everywhere. Public baths. Courts. Temples. Food markets. Administrative offices. Military payment stations. Even certain public punishments. Yes, even executions sometimes involved waiting in a queue while officials prepared the paperwork. Which, if you think about it, is a deeply Roman situation. Standing calmly in line while the government processes forms before something unpleasant happens. Fast forward 2,000 years. And here we are. Standing quietly behind strangers, staring at the backs of their jackets, occasionally inching forward a few steps. Nobody questions it. Nobody asks if there might be a faster system. Even when faster systems exist, we often recreate the line anyway. Airports build elaborate zigzag queue barriers. Theme parks turn waiting into a carefully managed experience. Coffee shops design ordering spaces that subtly encourage lines to form automatically. It feels polite, civilized, normal. But this quiet obedience to the line is, in many ways, a Roman inheritance. The line is not efficient. The line is symbolic. It tells people the system is working, even when it really isn't. And the most Roman moment of all happens when someone cuts the line. Suddenly, strangers who were ignoring each other become emotionally united. Everyone notices. Everyone silently judges. Sometimes someone even says something. Because the line is sacred. Not the service. Not the product. The line. And somewhere, if ancient Romans could see us now, patiently waiting in neat rows for coffee and airport security, they would probably nod approvingly. Because the system still works. Another Roman invention that quietly dominates modern life is paperwork. If Rome had a national religion, it might have been documentation. Romans did not trust memory. They did not trust verbal promises. They barely trusted each other. But they trusted written records. Ink on parchment. Wax seals. Witness signatures. Official copies stored in archives. If something was not written down, it might as well never have happened. Roman contracts governed nearly everything. Marriage agreements. Property sales. Loans. Business partnerships. Employment arrangements. Rental agreements. Slave ownership. Slave freedom. Debt forgiveness. Even temporary favors sometimes became written contracts. These documents were not simple. Roman legal language had a reputation for being long, repetitive, and deliberately complicated. When people struggle to understand a document, they assume it must be important. And if something feels official enough, people obey it even if they don't fully understand it. Rome built an entire legal culture around this principle. Lawyers thrived. Scribes made steady incomes copying documents. Courts stored massive collections of records. Disputes were settled not by memory, but by paperwork. And if you think this sounds familiar, it should. Today, almost every major activity involves contracts. You sign documents when renting an apartment. You sign documents when starting a job. You sign documents when taking a loan. You click digital agreements for software. You accept terms and conditions on websites. These modern contracts are often astonishingly long. Longer than many ancient books. And almost nobody reads them. Not because people are lazy. But because the system doesn't expect you to. The act of agreement matters more than the understanding of agreement. Which is a very Roman idea. When you click, I agree, you're not demonstrating comprehension. You're participating in a ritual that gives the system legitimacy. Rome would understand that perfectly. To a Roman lawyer, modern terms of service agreements would look completely normal. Long. Confusing. Official. Binding. And signed by people who probably skimmed the first sentence before accepting everything. In many ways, we haven't improved the Roman system. We've simply digitized it. Instead of wax seals, we have checkboxes. Instead of scribes, we have automated servers. Instead of parchment archives, we have cloud storage. But the principle remains the same. Written agreements create authority. Understanding them is optional. Another Roman habit that survived surprisingly well is bureaucracy. Rome loved administration. It loved offices. It loved officials. And most importantly, it loved procedures. Running an empire required enormous amounts of organization. Taxes had to be collected. Roads had to be maintained. Armies had to be supplied. Cities had to be governed. Citizenship had to be recorded. Land ownership had to be tracked. Rome solved this problem the way many large systems still do. By creating layers. And more layers. And then a few additional layers just to supervise the earlier layers. If you wanted something from the Roman government, you rarely received an immediate answer. You submitted a petition. An official reviewed the petition. Another official reviewed the review. Someone checked whether the document had the proper seal. Someone verified the identity of the petitioner. Someone recorded the decision in official records. Only after all of this did anything actually happen. From a modern perspective, this sounds frustrating. But Rome discovered something powerful about bureaucracy. It slows people down. And slow systems are harder to revolt against. When citizens spend their energy navigating procedures, they have less energy left for rebellion. Frustration becomes routine. Waiting becomes normal. Complaining becomes background noise. Modern bureaucracies function in remarkably similar ways. You submit forms. You wait for approval. You call departments that redirect you to other departments. You repeat information several times to different officials. Nobody is necessarily malicious. But everyone is following procedure. And procedure is sacred. This is one of Rome's most enduring legacies. Not the roads. Not the aqueducts. Not even the military strategies. But the quiet belief that systems must be processed, not questioned. And once you notice it, Rome begins to feel strangely alive in the modern world. Even if the empire itself disappeared long ago. Another rule that quietly traveled from ancient Rome into modern life is the strange power of titles. Romans loved titles. Not small titles. Very long, very impressive titles. Titles that sounded important even when nobody could clearly explain what the person actually did all day. In Rome, a title wasn't just a job description. It was a signal. A shortcut. A social command that told everyone else how they were expected to behave. If someone was introduced as a consul, people listened. If someone was called a senator, people showed respect. If someone carried the title praetor, citizens assumed that person understood the law. Whether or not they actually did was, sometimes less important. Rome governed an enormous empire. Millions of people lived across vast distances, speaking different languages and following different traditions. You couldn't expect every citizen to personally evaluate every official's competence. That would take far too long. So Rome created something simpler. Titles equal authority. If the title says this person is important, then everyone behaves as if it must be true. It's an elegant psychological trick. You don't need to constantly prove competence if society agrees the title itself is proof. And this system worked surprisingly well. A Roman citizen walking through a crowded forum didn't need to investigate the life story of every official. They simply noticed the robes, heard the title, and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Deference saved time. Hierarchy created order. And Rome valued order above nearly everything else. Fast forward 2,000 years and the titles have changed, but the instinct remains exactly the same. Today we hear words like manager, director, senior advisor, executive officer, chief strategist, lead consultant, vice president of something that sounds extremely complicated. Most people don't fully understand what these roles involve. But the titles themselves carry weight. When someone introduces themselves with an impressive title, something subtle happens in the room. People listen more carefully. They nod more often. They assume the person speaking probably knows what they're talking about. Even if the explanation that follows is somewhat unclear. In meetings around the world, entire conversations unfold where everyone politely agrees with someone whose title implies authority. Not because the argument is flawless. but because the title says it should be respected. Romans would recognize this dynamic immediately. In their world, challenging someone of higher rank wasn't just disagreement. It was considered disruptive. It threatened the social structure that made Roman administration function. Modern workplaces often carry a similar expectation. Questioning someone senior can sometimes be labeled unprofessional, difficult, or not collaborative. The language is different. But the logic is extremely familiar. Rome built a culture where hierarchy replaced constant evaluation. Instead of asking, "Is this person correct?" people often ask, "What is this person's position?" And once that question is answered, the conversation tends to settle. Titles create a comforting illusion that the system is stable. Even when the people inside the system are improvising wildly. Roman history, of course, is filled with officials who were wildly incompetent. Governors who mismanaged provinces. Generals who misunderstood strategy. Administrators who made catastrophic decisions with complete confidence. But the structure itself rarely changed. Because once society agrees that titles equal authority, the system no longer needs to prove itself constantly. It only needs to look official. And humans are surprisingly good at respecting things that look official. Especially if they come with impressive robes. Or, in modern times, very long email signatures. Clothing is another Roman rule that quietly survived the centuries. Ancient Romans believed clothing communicated something extremely important. Not personality. Not comfort. Status. What you wore told everyone exactly where you belonged in society. And more importantly, where you did not. The most famous example is the toga. Modern images often show Romans wearing togas casually, like comfortable draped clothing. In reality, the toga was heavy. It was awkward. It required careful arrangement to stay in place. Walking long distances in one was inconvenient. Working in one was almost impossible. And that was the point. The toga was not designed for practicality. It was designed for symbolism. Only Roman male citizens were allowed to wear it. Foreigners could not. Slaves absolutely could not. Women wore entirely different garments. The toga functioned like a walking declaration of legal identity. When someone wore one in public, it quietly announced, "This person has rights." Clothing created immediate social recognition. You didn't need to ask questions. You could see the hierarchy instantly. Rome loved systems that made hierarchy visible. It saved time. And it reduced confusion. Naturally, this also created many rules. Different types of togas existed for different occasions. Magistrates wore special versions with decorative stripes. Young boys wore protective amulets and specific garments until they became adults. Senators had distinctive clothing that marked their rank. If someone wore the wrong garment in the wrong place, people noticed immediately. Sometimes the punishment was simply embarrassment. Sometimes it involved fines. And occasionally someone with authority would politely but firmly escort the improperly dressed person away. Because appearance mattered. Fast forward 2,000 years and dress codes still exist almost everywhere. Offices expect professional attire. Courtrooms have specific clothing expectations. Formal events have dress requirements. Schools often have uniforms. Even casual workplaces sometimes maintain unspoken clothing standards. And these standards rarely exist because the clothing makes the job easier. In fact, many professional outfits are not particularly comfortable. Tight shoes. Restrictive jackets. Stiff collars. Clothing designed more for appearance than function. Which is exactly how Roman clothing worked. The purpose is not comfort. The purpose is signaling. Dressing correctly shows respect for the environment and the hierarchy within it. Dressing incorrectly signals rebellion, or ignorance. Sometimes both. What makes modern dress codes particularly Roman is how unclear they often are. Many workplaces never fully explain the rules. Employees are simply expected to know what professional looks like. And when someone accidentally breaks the rule, everyone suddenly remembers the guidelines very clearly. Rome operated the same way. Many social rules were never written down. Citizens learned them through observation, correction, and occasionally embarrassment. Which meant the system enforced itself. No guards required. Just side glances, quiet judgment, and the subtle pressure of social expectation. Humans are extremely good at maintaining systems like this. Especially when belonging depends on following them. So the next time you put on clothing that feels slightly uncomfortable because a situation requires it, remember that you're participating in a tradition that ancient Romans would recognize immediately. You're not just getting dressed. You're signaling your place in the social order. Rome would approve. Another Roman habit that survived remarkably well is the belief that systems are always correct. Individuals might fail. Circumstances might be unfortunate. But the system itself? Untouchable. Romans built their empire on laws that were complex, rigid, and sometimes extremely unforgiving. If a legal process produced an unfair result, people might complain about the officials involved. They might file petitions. They might attempt appeals. But suggesting that the entire system itself might be flawed was a much more dangerous idea. Because once people begin questioning the structure, control becomes harder to maintain. So Rome cultivated a powerful cultural belief. If something goes wrong, the problem must be somewhere else. Perhaps the form was filled incorrectly. Perhaps the request was submitted too late. Perhaps the person misunderstood the rules. Perhaps the outcome was unfortunate but technically correct. And technically correct was often considered the best kind of correct. Modern bureaucratic systems frequently operate with the same quiet assumption. If paperwork disappears, it's usually blamed on an error somewhere in the process. If deadlines conflict, the individual is expected to resolve the confusion. If procedures make no sense, people are encouraged to follow them anyway. You might feel frustrated. But expressing that frustration too strongly can quickly shift attention away from the system and toward the person complaining. Suddenly the issue becomes attitude rather than structure. Rome understood this psychological maneuver very well. If citizens blame themselves for difficulties navigating the system remains protected. People keep trying. They fill out forms again. They submit new applications. They wait patiently. Persistence is allowed. Resistance is discouraged. And gradually, the system trains people to accept inefficiency as part of normal life. Modern phrases like, "That's just how the process works," would sound perfectly familiar in ancient Rome. They signal resignation. Not approval. But acceptance. Which is often enough to keep a complex system running. Even when it doesn't always run particularly well. Roman society also believed strongly in another social tool that still appears everywhere today. Public embarrassment. If you want people to follow rules, there are many ways to enforce compliance. You can punish them privately. You can fine them quietly. You can warn them discreetly. Or you can make an example out of them in front of everyone. Rome preferred the last option. Roman courts were not private affairs. They were performances. Trials happened in public forums. Accusations were spoken aloud. Witnesses testified in front of crowds. Judgments were visible. And suddenly a very large audience is watching someone experience consequences. Sometimes this public accountability is justified. Sometimes it becomes excessive. But the psychological mechanism is ancient. Rome understood that embarrassment travels faster than laws. And once a culture becomes comfortable with public shaming, social pressure begins enforcing rules automatically. People monitor their own behavior carefully. Not because a guard might appear. But because an audience might. In Rome, that audience stood in the forum. Today, it scrolls through comment sections. And in both cases, the lesson spreads quickly. Avoid becoming the example. And perhaps one of the most enduring Roman assumptions of all involves age. Romans believed age carried authority. Not because every older person was wise, but because survival itself seemed like a form of experience. Life in the ancient world was unpredictable. Disease, war, accidents, and political intrigue shortened many lives. So someone who managed to live long enough to develop gray hair automatically attracted respect. The Roman Senate itself reflected this belief. The word Senate comes from the Latin word senex, which means old man. The Senate was literally a council of elders. The assumption was simple. Older individuals had seen more of life. They had navigated more crises. They had accumulated allies, enemies, knowledge, and patience. And therefore they were better suited to guide the state. Youth, on the other hand, was viewed with suspicion. Young people were energetic, ambitious, impulsive. All qualities that could easily become dangerous in politics. So Rome placed decision-making power largely in the hands of those who had been around long enough to develop restraint. Whether or not restraint actually appeared was another matter. But the principle remained popular. And modern societies still carry echoes of this idea. Seniority matters in many workplaces. Years of service often translate into authority. Experienced employees receive automatic respect. Even when younger colleagues might occasionally have better ideas. Challenging older authority figures can still feel uncomfortable. Not always because the argument is weak, but because cultural expectations quietly encourage deference. This respect for age can be valuable. Experience does matter. History does teach lessons. But Rome's version of the rule sometimes leaned toward assumption rather than evaluation. If someone had survived long enough, they must know something. And once society begins equating age with authority, that belief tends to reinforce itself. Older individuals hold leadership positions. Leadership positions accumulate influence. Influence shapes future decisions. And the cycle continues. Rome built its political structure around that cycle. And in many ways, we never completely stopped doing the same thing. Another quiet rule that modern life inherited from Rome is the idea that work must look busy. Not necessarily productive. Not necessarily efficient. But visibly busy. Ancient Rome had an unusual relationship with work. On one hand, the empire relied on enormous amounts of labor. Roads were built. Aqueducts stretched across valleys. Cities expanded. Armies marched. Markets operated constantly. Yet Roman elites believed that respectable citizens should not appear to work too hard. Manual labor was often associated with slaves, laborers, or the lower classes. For wealthy Romans, the ideal public image was something slightly different. You were supposed to look occupied with important matters. Meetings. Legal discussions. Political conversations. Visits to the forum. Reviewing documents. Consulting advisors. All of these activities created the appearance of responsibility and authority. But the key word here is appearance. In Roman political life, simply being seen frequently in the forum gave the impression that you were engaged in serious work, even if much of the time was spent talking, listening, or waiting for something to happen. A Roman senator might spend hours walking slowly through public spaces, greeting people, discussing minor issues, and observing events. From the outside, this looked extremely important. From the inside, it sometimes involved long stretches of polite conversation and very gradual progress. But the image of busyness mattered. It reassured citizens that their leaders were actively managing the state. Modern office culture often follows a surprisingly similar pattern. In many workplaces, productivity is difficult to measure directly. So instead, people measure visible activity. Who attends meetings? Who responds to emails quickly? Who appears present and engaged? Who stays late? Who seems constantly occupied? Sometimes the appearance of effort becomes almost as important as the actual results. Employees learn subtle habits that signal productivity. Typing while looking focused. Walking quickly through hallways. Scheduling meetings. Discussing projects. Checking messages frequently. None of these behaviors are necessarily inefficient. But they also don't always correspond perfectly with meaningful work. Rome would understand this dynamic immediately. Because Roman political life also relied heavily on signaling. Being seen. Being present. Looking engaged. All of these created legitimacy. In fact, Roman politicians often held something called a salutatio, a daily ritual where clients and supporters visited their homes early in the morning. People would arrive to greet the patron, discuss requests, and show loyalty. For the politician, the event served an additional purpose. It demonstrated influence. A house filled with visitors suggested power. More visitors meant more prestige. Even if many of the conversations involved routine matters, the crowd itself created an image of importance. Today, professional environments sometimes recreate similar dynamics. Busy calendars. Frequent meetings. Large email chains. Video calls with many participants. Each of these signals engagement with the system. Even when actual decisions are made by only a few people. This doesn't mean modern work is meaningless. Far from it. But the human instinct to associate visible activity with productivity is extremely old. Rome practiced it long before offices existed. And somehow, 2,000 years later, we still do. Sometimes without noticing. Another Roman habit that shaped modern life is the strange relationship people have with taxes. Nobody likes taxes. This is one of the few historical constants shared across nearly every civilization. But Rome turned tax collection into something both sophisticated and deeply frustrating. Instead of collecting every tax directly through government officials, Rome often hired private contractors called publicani. These contractors paid the government in advance for the right to collect taxes from a specific region. Then they traveled to that region and gathered the money from citizens. Any extra revenue they collected beyond the amount owed to Rome became their profit. This system had advantages. It reduced the administrative burden on the state. It ensured the government received its funds quickly. But it also created problems. Because the publicani were strongly motivated to collect as much money as possible. Sometimes more than was strictly fair. Citizens often complained that tax collectors were aggressive, persistent, and extremely creative when interpreting financial obligations. Sound familiar? Modern taxation systems are usually more regulated. But many citizens still experience taxes as something complicated, confusing, and slightly mysterious. Forms must be completed. Deadlines must be remembered. Records must be kept. Mistakes can lead to penalties. Even people who follow every rule carefully sometimes feel uncertain whether everything was done correctly. Rome recognized something important about taxes. If the system becomes complicated enough, most citizens will simply comply rather than challenge it. Complexity discourages resistance. And complexity has been part of tax systems ever since. In the Roman world, complaining about taxes was practically a national pastime. Writers joked about greedy collectors. Citizens argued about fairness. Philosophers debated the proper balance between public duty and personal wealth. Yet despite all the complaints, the system continued functioning. Because Rome needed revenue to maintain its empire. Armies required payment. Roads required maintenance. Cities required administration. Taxes funded the entire structure. Modern governments operate under the same basic reality. Large societies require resources to function. And so taxation continues. Occasionally adjusted. frequently debated, but rarely eliminated. Rome would find this situation very familiar. Because despite thousands of years of change, humans still have the same complicated relationship with public money. We need it. We argue about it. And we fill out forms hoping everything was calculated correctly. Another Roman tradition that still shapes everyday behavior is the expectation of punctuality. Interestingly, the Romans themselves did not measure time the same way we do today. Mechanical clocks didn't exist yet. Instead, they used sundials, water clocks, and natural observation. Hours were not always the same length throughout the year. Summer daylight hours were longer. Winter daylight hours were shorter. But even without modern precision, Roman society valued the idea of arriving when expected. Public events had scheduled start times. Court sessions began at particular hours. Markets opened and closed according to routine. Military operations required coordinated timing. In a large city like Rome, millions of daily interactions depended on shared expectations about when things should happen. Being late disrupted these systems. If a judge arrived hours late, court cases stalled. If merchants delayed opening their stalls, trade slowed. If military units moved out of sync, operations became chaotic. So gradually, punctuality became associated with reliability. Someone who consistently arrived when promised gained a reputation for discipline. Someone who frequently appeared late risked looking careless. This cultural value spread through Roman administration, military life, and business practices. Over time, it became part of the broader Roman identity. The empire ran on schedules, even if the exact measurement of time was less precise than today. Modern societies take punctuality even more seriously. Clocks appear everywhere. Phones track seconds. Meetings begin at specific times. Trains depart according to precise schedules. Being late often carries social consequences. People apologize. Excuses are offered. Sometimes reputations are quietly affected. A person who arrives consistently on time appears dependable. Someone who repeatedly misses deadlines may appear unreliable. This expectation feels normal today. But it is part of a long historical tradition of organized societies valuing coordination. Rome helped spread that idea across much of Europe and beyond. Because large systems only function smoothly when people agree on shared timing. Even if occasionally, someone oversleeps. Rome also believed strongly in another rule that quietly shapes modern life. The importance of reputation. In Roman society, reputation could determine nearly everything. Political opportunities. Business partnerships. Marriage arrangements. Legal credibility. Public influence. Without modern identification systems or digital records, people relied heavily on social memory. What others believed about you mattered enormously. A respected reputation opened doors. A damaged reputation closed them. Roman writers often discussed the concept of dignitas, a word that roughly combines honor, prestige, and public standing. Maintaining dignitas required careful behavior. A Roman citizen had to consider how actions might appear to others. Generosity improved reputation. Cowardice damaged it. Dishonesty spread quickly through social networks. Even rumors could influence someone's standing. Because reputation existed in the minds of other people. And once public opinion shifted, repairing it could take years. Modern society still operates under a similar principle. Although technology has changed how information spreads, the basic idea remains identical. Reputation influences trust. Trust influences opportunity. A positive reputation encourages cooperation. A negative one discourages it. Employers check references. Businesses protect brand images. Public figures manage public perception carefully. Individuals curate social media profiles that present particular versions of themselves. All of this reflects an ancient understanding. Humans evaluate each other continuously. We remember patterns. We share stories. And those stories shape future interactions. Rome understood this dynamic deeply. A person's reputation traveled through conversations, letters, and public actions. Today it travels through digital platforms, reviews, and search results. But the underlying human instinct has not changed. We still care what others think. Sometimes more than we admit. Because reputation remains one of the most powerful social currencies ever invented. And Rome invested heavily in it. Now, if ancient Romans could quietly observe the modern world today, they might be surprised by many things. Electric lights. Airplanes. Digital communication. Cities larger than anything they ever imagined. But beneath those dramatic changes, they would recognize many familiar patterns. People still stand patiently in lines. They still trust documents more than memory. They still respect titles. They still dress to signal status. They still protect reputations. They still navigate bureaucracies. They still follow systems that sometimes seem confusing but somehow keep society moving. Rome may have fallen long ago. Its armies disappeared. Its emperors vanished into history. But its habits, those survived beautifully. Quietly embedded inside daily life. Often unnoticed. But always there. And perhaps that is the most Roman outcome imaginable. Because Rome didn't just conquer territories. It shaped behaviors. And behaviors have a way of lasting much longer than empires. Another Roman habit that quietly shaped the modern world is the way societies think about rules inside families. To understand this one, we have to step inside an ordinary Roman household. Not a palace. Not an emperor's residence. Just a normal Roman home somewhere in the busy streets of the city. In that house lived parents, children, sometimes grandparents, and often several servants or enslaved workers. Families were large, busy, and filled with daily responsibilities. But there was one person who stood clearly at the center of authority. The paterfamilias. This Latin word simply means, father of the family, but in Roman law it meant something much larger than modern fatherhood. The paterfamilias held legal power over the entire household. Children remained under his authority even after becoming adults. Sons could serve in the army, marry, and raise children of their own, and technically still fall under the legal authority of their father. Daughters also remained under family authority until marriage, and sometimes even after. Property decisions were controlled by the head of the household. Financial agreements required his approval. Major family choices flowed through that central figure. To modern ears, this sounds extremely strict. And in many ways it was. But the Roman system also created something that still exists today, a clear idea that families operate with internal hierarchies. Even in modern households where authority is more balanced. Many traditions still reflect Roman family structure. Parents guide children. Older members of the family hold influence. Major decisions often involve consultation with elders. Family names carry identity across generations. Rome strongly believed that stability inside the household created stability in society. If families followed clear structures, the larger state would function more smoothly. And because Rome valued order above almost everything else, family hierarchy became part of the social foundation. Interestingly, Roman fathers were also expected to demonstrate responsibility. Authority came with obligations. They were responsible for education, discipline, and the general well-being of the household. A respected Roman father balanced power with protection. If he ruled harshly or irresponsibly, his reputation suffered. And reputation, as we discussed earlier, mattered enormously. Modern families are far more flexible in structure. Many cultures emphasize partnership rather than strict hierarchy. But the lingering idea that families contain roles and responsibilities still echoes Roman thinking. Parents guide. Children learn. Generations influence one another. The exact structure may vary from home to home, but the basic concept remains familiar. Rome believed that society began at the dinner table. And in many ways, it still does. Speaking of dinner tables, Roman eating habits also left quiet marks on modern life. Meals in ancient Rome were social events. Not quick interruptions between tasks. Not rushed snacks eaten while standing. For many Romans, especially wealthier citizens, dinner was a long ritual. Guests gathered. Food arrived in multiple courses. Conversation flowed slowly through the evening. People discussed politics, philosophy, business, and rumors from across the empire. Meals could last hours. The goal was not just nourishment. It was connection. Rome understood that shared meals strengthened relationships. Alliances formed over food. Friendships deepened. Business partnerships quietly emerged between courses. Even today, some of our most important conversations still happen around tables. Families eat together. Friends meet for dinner. Colleagues discuss ideas over lunch. Celebrations revolve around shared meals. The structure may look different now, but the instinct is very old. Humans bond through eating together. And Rome turned that instinct into an art form. Of course, Roman dining also followed social rules. Guests were often arranged according to status. Important individuals received better seating. Servants moved quietly through the room delivering dishes. Hosts carefully managed the evening's flow. If someone behaved poorly during dinner, word spread quickly. A bad guest risked damaging their reputation. Good manners at the table became another signal of social belonging. Modern etiquette guides still contain similar advice. Be polite. Respect the host. Avoid embarrassing behavior. Because even today, dinner tables remain small stages where social relationships quietly unfold. Rome simply formalized something humans were already doing. And somehow, the tradition survived. Education is another area where Roman influence quietly persists. Roman children, especially boys from wealthy families, received structured education designed to prepare them for public life. Teachers instructed them in reading, writing, and arithmetic. But Roman education placed particular emphasis on rhetoric. Rhetoric was the art of persuasive speaking. Students practiced constructing arguments. They learned how to organize ideas. They studied famous speeches delivered by respected leaders. Why was rhetoric so important? Because Roman society valued public discussion. Political debates happened in the forum. Legal cases unfolded before crowds. Leaders gained influence through speeches that convinced citizens to support their ideas. A person who could speak clearly and persuasively held enormous power. Roman schools therefore trained students to think carefully about language. How to explain ideas. How to persuade audiences. How to structure complex arguments. Modern education systems still emphasize many of these same skills. Students write essays. They give presentations. They debate ideas in classrooms. Communication remains one of the most valuable abilities anyone can develop. Whether someone becomes a lawyer, a teacher, a manager, or an engineer, the ability to explain ideas clearly often determines success. Rome understood this long ago. Words shape decisions. Decisions shape societies. So teaching people how to use language effectively became a cornerstone of education. Even now, 2,000 years later, students still practice the art of expressing thoughts in organized ways. The classrooms may look different. The textbooks have changed. But the goal remains surprisingly similar. Learn to think clearly. Learn to speak clearly. And the world may listen. Another Roman rule that continues quietly today involves public spaces. Rome built extraordinary cities. Roads connected neighborhoods. Markets filled with merchants. Bathhouses offered relaxation and conversation. Temples stood beside government buildings. Public squares hosted debates, announcements, and celebrations. These spaces were not accidental. Roman urban planning aimed to bring citizens together. The Forum in particular served as the heart of many Roman cities. It functioned as a marketplace, meeting place, political stage, and social gathering area all at once. People came to buy goods. They came to hear news. They came to observe legal trials. They came to discuss rumors and share information. The Forum was where society happened. Modern cities continue building similar public environments. Parks invite people to gather. Town squares host events. Community centers encourage social activity. Even shopping malls and large plazas echo the Roman idea that people benefit from shared spaces. When individuals encounter each other in public environments, communities grow stronger. Ideas circulate. Relationships develop. And societies become more connected. Rome understood that isolation weakens civic life. Shared spaces encourage participation. Even today, many of our most meaningful social interactions occur in places where strangers gather peacefully. Coffee shops. Libraries. Parks. Markets. These environments may feel modern. But the concept behind them is extremely ancient. Rome built cities designed to keep people visible to one another. Because when citizens remain engaged with public life, societies tend to remain healthier. Another Roman habit that still echoes today is the way people celebrate success. Romans loved celebrations. Victorious generals received enormous parades called triumphs. Crowds lined the streets. Music played. Soldiers marched. Captured treasures were displayed. The general rode through the city in a decorated chariot while citizens cheered. These events served several purposes. They rewarded military success. They reinforced national pride. And they reminded citizens that great achievements deserved recognition. Modern societies continue celebrating success in remarkably similar ways. Athletes parade through cities after championships. Leaders receive public recognition. Award ceremonies highlight outstanding achievements. Graduations celebrate academic milestones. Even small accomplishments often receive congratulations and applause. Humans enjoy recognizing effort and success. It encourages others to pursue their own achievements. Rome understood this psychological effect. Celebrations motivate. They inspire. They reinforce shared values. Even today, when people gather to celebrate accomplishments, they are participating in a tradition that ancient Romans would understand immediately. Public recognition strengthens communities. And communities thrive when success becomes something people share together. So the next time you pause to think about your daily habits. Standing patiently in a line. Respecting someone's title. Dressing a certain way for work. Navigating paperwork. Caring about reputation. Arriving on time. Sharing meals. Learning communication skills. Gathering in public spaces. Celebrating achievements. You may notice something interesting. Many of these behaviors feel natural. Almost automatic. But they are not random. They are the quiet inheritance of centuries of cultural influence. And among the many civilizations that shaped the modern world, ancient Rome left fingerprints almost everywhere. Not always obvious, but remarkably persistent. The empire disappeared. Its armies vanished. Its marble monuments slowly weathered under time. But the habits, the small rules that organize everyday life, those traveled forward through history. And they continue guiding modern societies in ways most people never notice. Which might be the most Roman legacy of all. A system so deeply embedded in daily life that nobody thinks to question where it began. Another quiet Roman habit that still shapes modern life is the way people organize their daily routine. Ancient Romans believed strongly in the power of predictable schedules. Life in a large city like Rome required coordination. Markets opened at certain hours. Legal courts began their proceedings early in the morning. Government officials handled petitions during specific parts of the day. Merchants arranged their work around these rhythms. The Roman day usually began very early. Sunrise mattered. Without electric lighting, daylight was valuable, and Romans tried to use as much of it as possible. Many citizens woke shortly after dawn. They washed, dressed, and often ate a very small early meal. Then the city slowly came alive. Shopkeepers opened their stalls. Bakers prepared bread. Workers headed toward construction sites or workshops. Messengers carried letters through busy streets. For wealthier Romans, the morning often involved receiving visitors. As mentioned earlier, patrons held the salutatio, where clients arrived to greet them and request favors or advice. After these morning duties, many Romans moved toward the forum. The forum was where official life happened. Legal disputes were argued. Political conversations unfolded. Business deals were negotiated. News spread rapidly between citizens. The midday hours were often quieter. People returned home to eat a modest meal and rest during the hottest part of the day. In warm Mediterranean climates, working continuously through midday heat could be exhausting. So Romans adapted their schedules. Work slowed down. Shops sometimes closed temporarily. People rested. Later in the afternoon, activity returned. Merchants reopened stalls. Citizens visited bathhouses. Friends gathered to talk and relax. Bathhouses were especially important in Roman daily life. They were not only places for bathing. They functioned as social centers where people exercised, discussed politics, exchanged gossip, and relaxed. Visiting the baths became a daily routine for many citizens. And after bathing, many Romans returned home for the main meal of the day, dinner. Dinner was often the longest part of the evening. Families gathered. Guests arrived. Food was shared slowly while conversation filled the room. After dinner, people rested. Without modern lighting and entertainment, evenings were quieter. Some Romans read or listened to poetry. Others simply talked with family members. Eventually, the city settled into darkness. And the cycle repeated the next day. Modern schedules look very different on the surface. Electric lights allow activity long after sunset. Digital devices fill evenings with entertainment. Many people work unusual hours. Yet the basic rhythm remains surprisingly similar. Morning routines. Midday pauses. Evening gatherings. Human bodies still respond to cycles of activity and rest. Rome didn't invent daily structure. Of course. But it helped normalize the idea that societies function best when large groups of people follow shared rhythms. Even today, entire cities move together through predictable patterns. Morning commutes. Lunch breaks. Evening relaxation. The shapes of these routines have changed, but their existence still reflects a very old idea. That life becomes easier when people move together through time. Another Roman habit that remains strangely familiar today is gossip. Humans have always shared stories about each other. But Roman cities were particularly good environments for rumors. Imagine a dense city filled with markets, bathhouses, forums, taverns, and crowded streets. News traveled quickly. So did speculation. If a politician argued loudly in the Senate, someone nearby would talk about it. If a wealthy citizen hosted a particularly extravagant dinner, guests might describe it later. If a general returned from war, stories about victories, and sometimes failures, spread through the population. Writers in Rome frequently complained about gossip. Some described it as unavoidable. Others treated it as entertainment. Still others warned that rumors could damage reputations unfairly. But despite these complaints, gossip remained a powerful social force. It connected communities. It spread information. And occasionally it created misunderstandings that lasted for years. Modern society often claims to dislike gossip. People say they prefer facts and fairness. Yet gossip continues everywhere. At workplaces. Inside schools. Across neighborhoods. And of course, online. The internet has dramatically increased the speed of information sharing. Stories travel instantly. Opinions multiply rapidly. Rumors sometimes spread faster than verified facts. Ancient Romans would recognize this dynamic immediately. They understood that humans are naturally curious about one another. We observe behavior. We discuss what we observe. We interpret events together. Sometimes our interpretations are accurate. Sometimes they are not. But the instinct to share social information appears almost universal. Rome simply provided one of the earliest large-scale examples of how powerful gossip can become in dense societies. Because when millions of people live close together, stories spread. And once stories spread, they shape reputation, relationships, and even politics. Roman society also valued something that still shapes modern culture: tradition. Romans loved traditions. Festivals honoring gods. Annual ceremonies marking important events. Family rituals repeated across generations. Public holidays celebrating victories or historical moments. These traditions helped create a shared identity. Citizens felt connected to the past. They participated in rituals their ancestors had followed for centuries. Even when people disagreed politically or socially, traditions reminded them they belonged to the same civilization. Modern societies maintain traditions for similar reasons. National holidays celebrate historical milestones. Families gather for annual celebrations. Communities host festivals that repeat year after year. Traditions provide continuity. They connect the present with the past. They remind people that they belong to something larger than their individual lives. Rome understood this emotional power very well. Maintaining tradition strengthened loyalty to the state. It reinforced the idea that Roman civilization was ancient, stable, and worthy of respect. Even today, traditions often survive long after people forget their original purpose. Holiday customs continue. Ceremonies repeat. Symbols remain meaningful. Sometimes people follow traditions simply because they always have. And that, in a way, is exactly how Roman traditions worked too. They were habits passed quietly from one generation to the next. Another surprisingly Roman feature of modern life is the importance of networking. Romans did not use the word networking. Of course. But they practiced something very similar. In Roman society, personal relationships mattered enormously. If you wanted to succeed in politics, you needed supporters. If you wanted business opportunities, you needed contacts. If you needed legal help, you needed someone who knew the right people. Connections opened doors. This system was called patronage. A powerful individual, known as a patron, supported clients who depended on their influence. Clients might request assistance finding work, resolving disputes, or gaining introductions to other influential figures. In return, clients offered loyalty and public support. They attended the patron's morning greeting rituals. They praised the patron in conversations. They strengthened the patron's reputation through visible loyalty. This system created large social networks. Power flowed through relationships. Opportunities moved through personal connections. Modern networking works in remarkably similar ways. Professional contacts help people find jobs. Colleagues recommend one another for projects. Mentors guide younger professionals. Friendships sometimes lead to business opportunities. The language has changed, but the basic principle remains identical. Humans rely on relationships. Trust grows through repeated interactions. And people are often more willing to help those they already know. Rome built entire political careers on these networks of mutual support. And modern societies continue doing something very similar. We simply call it networking instead of patronage. Perhaps the most interesting Roman habit of all is something extremely simple. Patience. Living inside a massive empire required patience. Travel was slow. Messages took time to arrive. Administrative decisions could take weeks or months. Waiting was part of daily life. Citizens waited in lines. They waited for legal judgments. They waited for letters from distant relatives. They waited for merchants bringing goods from faraway provinces. Patience became a normal skill. People learned to accept delays as part of life. Modern technology has shortened many waiting times dramatically. Messages travel instantly. Travel is faster. Information spreads quickly. Yet patience still appears in surprising places. Traffic jams. Customer service queues. Airport security lines. Government offices. Even in a fast world, people still find themselves waiting. And when they do, they often react in a very Roman way. They sigh. They shuffle forward slowly. They glance around the room. And eventually, they accept that waiting is simply part of participating in large systems. Rome discovered long ago that patience keeps societies functioning. Without it, frustration would constantly disrupt cooperation. So citizens learned to tolerate delays. Not always happily. But usually calmly. And perhaps that is one of Rome's most subtle legacies. The quiet ability to endure inconvenience while the system slowly continues operating. As the centuries passed, Rome eventually declined. Political instability grew. Economic pressures increased. Military challenges multiplied. Gradually, the empire weakened. And eventually, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. But the collapse did not erase everything Rome created. Roads remained. Languages evolved from Latin. Legal ideas survived. Architectural techniques influenced later civilizations. And perhaps most quietly of all, Roman habits continued shaping how societies organized themselves. Standing in lines. Respecting titles. Trusting paperwork. Following routines. Caring about reputation. Maintaining traditions. Building networks. Practicing patience. All of these behaviors feel normal today. Yet many of them passed through Roman culture before reaching the modern world. Empires come and go. But habits have a way of lasting much longer. And sometimes, without realizing it, we still live according to rules written thousands of years ago. Rules created by people who walked through marble forums, spoke Latin in crowded streets, and believed deeply in the power of order. Rome may be ancient history. But its quiet influence continues, every single day. Another surprisingly familiar Roman habit is the way people think about leisure. To modern ears, the word leisure often sounds like a luxury. Free time appears only after work is finished, responsibilities are handled, and the day finally slows down. But in ancient Rome, leisure had its own name and its own philosophy. Romans called it odium. Odium meant time away from work, public duty, and political obligations. But it wasn't necessarily idle laziness. At least, not the kind Romans respected. Good odium meant thoughtful rest. Reading. Writing. Discussing philosophy. Walking through gardens. Reflecting on ideas. Listening to poetry. Roman writers believed that balanced people needed both negotium, which meant business or duty, and odium, which meant reflective rest. Too much work created exhaustion. Too much idleness created weakness. The ideal Roman life balanced the two. Even powerful political leaders sometimes withdrew temporarily from public duties to spend time in the countryside reading, writing, and thinking. Philosophers especially loved this idea. They believed that quiet reflection improved judgment and wisdom. Interestingly, modern discussions about work-life balance sound remarkably similar. People talk about burnout. They discuss the need for rest. They encourage hobbies, exercise, reading, and relaxation. The language may be modern, but the idea is very old. Rome already understood that endless activity eventually drains the mind. Rest allows people to think clearly again. Of course, Romans didn't always follow their own advice perfectly. Some citizens worked constantly. Others enjoyed far more leisure than was healthy. But the cultural recognition that rest matters survived. Today, when someone schedules a vacation or sets aside time to recharge, they're participating in a very ancient idea. That life should contain moments of thoughtful quiet, not just endless responsibility. Another Roman influence that quietly appears in modern society is the way people think about public entertainment. Romans loved entertainment. Massive amphitheaters filled cities across the empire. Crowds gathered to watch gladiator contests, theatrical performances, athletic competitions, and chariot races. The largest of these venues could hold astonishing numbers of people. Rome's famous Colosseum, for example, seated tens of thousands of spectators. These events served several purposes. They entertained citizens. They reinforced cultural values like bravery and strength. And they created shared experiences that connected large populations. Imagine tens of thousands of people cheering together as chariots raced around the track. The energy would have been incredible. Modern stadiums function in remarkably similar ways. Fans gather to watch sporting events. Concert crowds sing along with musicians. Theaters present dramatic performances. Large audiences experience emotions together. Excitement spreads through the crowd. Victory creates celebration. Defeat creates disappointment. These collective emotional experiences strengthen social bonds. Rome understood this well. Public entertainment helped unify diverse populations. Citizens from different backgrounds gathered in the same space and reacted to the same events. Even today, major sporting events or concerts can create powerful moments of shared excitement. For a few hours, thousands of strangers feel connected through a common experience. The venues may be modern. The technologies may be new. But the emotional energy inside a crowded stadium would feel very familiar to ancient Romans. Another Roman habit that remains visible today is the importance of law. Roman law became one of the most influential legal systems in history. Instead of relying entirely on tradition or informal agreements, Rome worked to create written legal structures. Rules defined property ownership. Contracts established financial agreements. Legal procedures determined how disputes should be resolved. Judges listened to arguments and evaluated evidence. Roman legal thinkers spent centuries refining these systems. They debated fairness. They clarified definitions. They wrote detailed explanations describing how laws should apply in different situations. Over time, these ideas spread throughout the Roman Empire. And long after Rome itself declined, many later societies continued studying Roman legal principles. Modern legal systems still carry traces of those early ideas. Written laws define rights and responsibilities. Courts examine disputes between individuals or organizations. Judges interpret statutes. Lawyers present arguments. The basic structure, written rules applied through organized legal procedures, reflects a tradition that Rome helped strengthen. Of course, modern legal systems have evolved dramatically. They include protections and rights that ancient Romans never imagined. But the concept that societies should operate under clearly defined legal frameworks owes a great deal to Roman thinking. Because Rome believed that law created stability. When people understood the rules, conflicts could be resolved more predictably. And predictable systems encourage cooperation. Even today, societies rely heavily on legal frameworks to manage relationships between citizens, businesses, and governments. The details may vary. But the idea that written law forms the backbone of organized society is deeply Roman. Romans also cared deeply about architecture. Buildings were not only practical. They were symbolic. Large public structures demonstrated the strength and sophistication of Roman civilization. Aqueducts carried fresh water across long distances. Bathhouses provided comfort and hygiene. Temples honored religious traditions. Government buildings hosted political decisions. And amphitheaters entertained enormous crowds. Roman engineers developed techniques that allowed them to construct durable structures from stone, brick, and concrete. Some of these buildings still stand today, thousands of years later. Modern cities continue this tradition in interesting ways. Large government buildings signal authority. Monuments celebrate historical achievements. Museums preserve cultural memory. Public spaces create environments where communities gather. Architecture still communicates meaning. A tall courthouse suggests justice and stability. A grand library symbolizes knowledge. A stadium announces celebration and competition. Rome understood that buildings shape how people feel about their surroundings. Impressive architecture creates confidence in institutions. It reminds citizens that they belong to something larger than themselves. Even today, when people admire historic buildings or gather in large civic spaces, they are participating in a tradition that Rome helped develop. One final Roman habit that still feels familiar today is the way societies remember history. Romans cared deeply about their past. They told stories about the founding of their city. They honored famous leaders. They recorded military victories and political achievements. Statues commemorated important individuals. Public monuments preserved memories of significant events. Roman historians wrote detailed accounts describing wars, political struggles, and cultural changes. These stories helped shape Roman identity. Citizens believed they were part of a long tradition stretching back through generations. Modern societies do something very similar. History books describe earlier civilizations. Museums display artifacts. Memorials honor important moments. National holidays commemorate significant events. Communities preserve stories about their origins and development. These practices remind people that the present did not appear suddenly. It grew from countless decisions made by earlier generations. Rome valued historical memory because it strengthened cultural identity. Citizens who understood their past often felt stronger connections to their society. Even today, learning about history helps people understand why certain traditions exist and how current systems developed. In many ways, remembering history is itself a Roman habit. They believed the past offered lessons. And thousands of years later, people are still listening. So as we slowly reach the end of tonight's quiet journey through Roman habits, something interesting becomes clear. Ancient Rome disappeared a very long time ago. Its emperors are gone. Its armies are silent. Its marble temples stand mostly as ruins. And yet, Rome never completely left. Its ideas, systems, and habits quietly blended into later civilizations. They passed through centuries of change. Through medieval kingdoms. Through emerging nations. Through modern governments and cities. And eventually they became part of everyday life. Standing in lines. Trusting paperwork. Respecting titles. Following routines. Sharing meals. Caring about reputation. Gathering in public spaces. Celebrating achievements. Balancing work with rest. Watching entertainment together. Studying law. Building impressive cities. Remembering history. These behaviors feel natural now. But somewhere along their long journey through time, many of them passed through Rome. Which means that even today, thousands of years later, tiny pieces of Roman culture continue shaping daily life around the world. Quietly. Almost invisibly. But very persistently. And perhaps that is the most fitting legacy of all. Because Rome always believed in systems that lasted. Systems so strong, so deeply embedded, that people eventually stopped noticing them. And in many ways, they succeeded. As night settles more deeply over our slow journey through Roman habits, there is another small piece of Roman life that still feels familiar today. The Roman relationship with food. Food in Rome was not only about survival. It was also about routine, community, and rhythm. Most ordinary Romans ate very simple meals. Breakfast, called ientaculum, was usually small. It might include bread dipped in wine, olives, cheese, or fruit. Something quick, something light, just enough to begin the day. The larger meal often came later. Lunch, known as prandium, was still fairly modest for many people. Bread again, perhaps leftovers from the previous evening, vegetables, eggs, or fish if someone could afford it. But dinner was different. Dinner was called cena, and it was the most important meal of the day. Families gathered. Friends arrived. Guests reclined on couches around low tables. Food appeared slowly, in courses that could last for hours. A typical Roman dinner might begin with simple appetizers, olives, herbs, eggs, or small fish. Then came the main dishes. Roasted meats, vegetables, bread, sauces flavored with herbs, sometimes exotic ingredients brought from distant provinces of the empire. And finally, lighter foods like fruit, nuts, or sweet pastries. The purpose of these dinners wasn't only eating. Conversation filled the room. Stories were told. Guests debated politics, philosophy, and daily events. Meals moved slowly. No one rushed. In many ways, Roman dinners resemble modern social meals. When families gather around tables, when friends meet for long conversations over food, when celebrations stretch late into the evening, those rhythms echo something very old. Food has always been one of the easiest ways humans connect with one another. Rome simply made it part of everyday social life. Another Roman habit that quietly echoes into the modern world is the way people think about clothing. Roman clothing carried social meaning. Different garments communicated status, citizenship, and role within society. The most famous Roman garment was the toga. The toga was large, heavy, and carefully arranged. It was worn primarily by male citizens during formal situations. But despite its symbolic importance, the toga was not especially practical. It was difficult to wear. It required assistance to arrange properly. And it could be uncomfortable in everyday situations. So most Romans wore simpler clothing during daily life. Tunics were common. Light fabrics allowed easier movement. Sandals protected feet while walking through busy streets. Yet the toga remained important for official appearances. Because clothing communicated identity. Even small details could matter. Certain colors were restricted. Certain decorations signaled rank. Senators wore garments with distinctive purple stripes. High-ranking officials wore different styles during ceremonies. Modern clothing often serves similar purposes. Formal events require specific outfits. Professional environments expect particular dress codes. Uniforms identify workers in many industries. Clothing can communicate role, status, and belonging. Even without realizing it, people still use clothing as a quiet language. Rome understood this language very well. They simply expressed it through garments instead of business suits, uniforms, or casual wear. Another fascinating Roman habit is something surprisingly ordinary. Shopping. Roman cities contained busy marketplaces where people purchased everyday goods. Stalls lined streets and public squares. Vendors sold bread, vegetables, pottery, cloth, tools, and countless other items. Shoppers moved slowly through these areas examining products. Prices were sometimes negotiated. Merchants called out to attract attention. And the air filled with voices, footsteps, and conversation. Markets were more than places to buy goods. They were social spaces. Neighbors encountered each other. News spread. Arguments occasionally broke out over prices or quality. But mostly, markets simply represented the normal flow of urban life. Today's shopping districts feel very similar. Open markets still exist around the world. Street vendors sell food and goods. People wander between stalls comparing options. Modern supermarkets and malls look different, of course. But the basic activity, gathering goods necessary for daily life, remains the same. Commerce connects producers and consumers. Markets become gathering places. Rome developed large urban markets because growing cities needed organized ways to distribute food and goods. And once that system appeared, it never really disappeared. Modern economies simply expanded the idea. Another aspect of Roman life that still feels strangely familiar is public complaining. Romans complained. A lot. They complained about taxes. They complained about politics. They complained about crowded streets. They complained about rising prices. Writers in ancient Rome left behind letters and essays describing these frustrations. One Roman poet joked about noisy neighbors. Another writer grumbled about dishonest merchants. Others criticized politicians who made promises but failed to deliver results. In other words, the same kinds of complaints people still express today. Living in large societies creates shared problems. Traffic. Costs. Bureaucracy. Noise. Crowds. And when people encounter these inconveniences, they naturally talk about them. Sometimes humorously. Sometimes seriously. Sometimes with dramatic exaggeration. Complaining can actually serve a social function. It allows people to share frustrations. It creates a sense that others understand their experiences. It occasionally motivates improvements. Rome was no different. Citizens complained because they cared about their city. They wanted things to function well. And when they didn't, talking about the problems helped release tension. Even today, casual complaints appear in conversations everywhere. Workplaces. Public transportation. Restaurants. Online discussions. Complaining may not always solve problems, but it certainly helps people feel heard. And finally, as our slow exploration continues into the quiet hours of the night, we arrive at something deeply human that Rome understood very well. Routine. Daily routine shapes human life more than dramatic events. Great battles and political decisions fill history books, but ordinary days actually define most human experience. Romans woke. They worked. They ate. They visited friends. They walked through busy streets. They attended public events. They rested. Then they repeated the cycle again tomorrow. The details of Roman life were different from modern life, of course. Their technology was simpler. Their transportation slower. Their communication limited by distance. Yet the rhythm of human existence remains remarkably constant. People still wake up. Still prepare for the day. Still travel to places where responsibilities wait. Still return home to rest and connect with others. Most lives are built from these quiet patterns. And that is perhaps why Rome still feels strangely familiar after 2,000 years. Because beneath the marble buildings and Latin inscriptions, Roman citizens were simply people living through ordinary days. They worried about work. They shared meals. They enjoyed entertainment. They talked with friends. They tried to build comfortable lives within the systems around them. In other words, they lived lives that were not so different from ours. And as the night grows quieter and the streets outside grow still, the story of Rome gently fades into the background. Not as a tale of emperors or armies, but as a reminder that history is often made of small habits repeated over long periods of time. Habits that travel quietly through centuries. Habits that shape the world long after their origins are forgotten. And somewhere in those habits, a small piece of Rome continues. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But softly, in the background of everyday life. Just as it has for thousands of years. As the quiet rhythm of Roman life continues to unfold, there is another part of daily life that would feel surprisingly familiar to many modern people. Work. For most Romans, work filled a large part of the day. And just like today, not all work looked the same. Some Romans were craftsmen. They built furniture, shaped pottery, worked with metal, carved stone, or stitched clothing. Their workshops often sat directly beside the street. Doors remained open so that passers-by could see the work being done. The sounds of tools tapping, scraping, and cutting blended into the background noise of the city. Other Romans worked as merchants. They sold goods in markets or small shops. Some specialized in particular items: bread, oil, wine, cloth, jewelry. Others sold many different things, adapting to whatever customers needed most. And then there were laborers. Dock workers unloaded cargo arriving by ship. Construction workers helped build new structures or repair old ones. Carriers transported goods through narrow streets using carts or animals. For these workers, the day could be long and tiring. But work also created community. People in the same trade often knew each other well. They shared advice, discussed prices, and sometimes helped train younger apprentices who hoped to learn the craft. Apprenticeship was common in Rome. A young person might spend years learning under an experienced worker. They watched carefully, practiced skills slowly, and gradually improved. Over time, the apprentice might become skilled enough to open their own workshop. Modern careers still follow a similar pattern. Beginners learn from experienced workers. Skills develop gradually. Knowledge passes from one generation to the next. The tools may have changed, but the process of learning through practice remains almost identical. Another interesting part of Roman life was housing. Not everyone in Rome lived in grand villas with marble columns. In fact, most people lived in apartment buildings. These buildings were called insulae. An insula could rise several stories tall, packed with small rooms where families lived closely together. The lower floors often contained shops or workshops. Upper floors held apartments. And the higher someone lived in the building, the smaller and less comfortable the apartment usually became. Water was harder to carry upstairs. Heat was harder to maintain in winter. And the wooden construction sometimes made fires a serious danger. Life inside these crowded buildings could be noisy. Neighbors talked through thin walls. Children ran up and down staircases. Street sounds drifted through windows. But despite the challenges, these apartments allowed huge numbers of people to live inside the city. Rome was one of the largest cities in the ancient world. At its height, it may have held over 1 million people. Housing so many individuals required creative solutions. And in many ways, insulae resemble modern apartment buildings. Cities today still rely on multi-story housing to accommodate growing populations. People share walls with neighbors. They hear sounds from nearby apartments. They adapt to life in crowded urban spaces. Once again, the basic idea feels very Roman. Another quiet part of Roman daily life involved transportation. Without cars, trains, or buses, movement through the city looked very different. Most people walked. Roman streets were busy with pedestrians moving in every direction. Merchants pushed carts. Workers carried goods. Citizens traveled between homes, markets, temples, and bathhouses. Some wealthier individuals used horses or small carriages. But inside the crowded center of the city, walking remained the easiest way to get around. Roman roads outside the city were famous for their quality. Engineers designed them carefully using layers of stone and gravel. These roads allowed armies, merchants, and travelers to move across enormous distances. Messages could travel from one province to another. Goods could reach markets thousands of kilometers away. Even today, the phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," reflects the scale of this network. Modern highways and rail systems serve similar purposes. They connect distant places. They allow people and goods to move efficiently across large regions. The vehicles have changed. But the idea of building strong transportation networks to support trade and communication remains a very Roman legacy. Roman children experienced daily life differently than adults. Childhood involved learning, helping with household duties, and gradually preparing for adult responsibilities. Some children attended schools where teachers taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. Lessons often took place in simple rooms with wooden benches. Students practiced writing on wax tablets using styluses. They copied passages repeatedly to improve their skills. Teachers sometimes emphasized memorization. Students recited poems or passages from famous texts. Education could be strict. Teachers expected attention and discipline. But many families believed education offered important opportunities for their children. Not all children attended formal schools, however. Many learned practical skills at home. They helped parents with household tasks or business activities. They watched adults closely, slowly learning the routines of daily life. Modern childhood includes far more formal education than Roman times. Yet some similarities remain. Students still practice reading and writing. They still learn through repetition and observation. And they still spend years gradually preparing for adult life. Another fascinating part of Roman culture involved travel. Although journeys were slower than today, Romans traveled surprisingly often. Merchants moved between cities selling goods. Officials traveled to distant provinces for government duties. Soldiers marched along roads connecting the empire. Even ordinary citizens sometimes journeyed to visit relatives, attend festivals, or explore famous locations. Travel required planning. People packed food, money, and supplies. They often stayed at roadside inns called mansions, where travelers could rest before continuing the journey. These inns provided meals, beds, and sometimes stables for animals. Travelers shared stories with strangers. News spread from region to region. The empire felt smaller because roads connected so many distant places. Modern travel is far faster. Airplanes cross continents in hours. Cars reach distant cities quickly. But the desire to explore new places, visit family, and experience different cultures remains timeless. Romans felt that same curiosity. They simply moved through the world at a slower pace. As the hours pass and the quiet story of Rome continues to drift gently forward, something becomes increasingly clear. History is not only about dramatic moments. It is about ordinary days. About people waking early, working carefully, sharing meals, walking through busy streets, learning new skills, and resting when the sun finally sets. Rome was filled with these ordinary moments. Millions of them. And together, those moments formed one of the most influential civilizations in human history. But at its heart, Rome was simply a place where people lived their lives. Not so different from cities today. People hoped for comfort. They worried about problems. They enjoyed friendships. They followed routines that made the world feel stable. And slowly, over centuries, those routines shaped systems that still influence the modern world. Quiet habits. Repeated endlessly. Passed forward through time. And now, thousands of years later, we can still see their echoes. In the rhythm of daily work. In the structure of cities. In the routines of ordinary life. Rome may belong to the distant past. But its quiet influence still walks beside us. Step by step. Day by day. Just as it always has. As the night grows quieter and the steady rhythm of Roman life continues, we can turn our attention to something that shaped the atmosphere of the city in subtle ways. The evening. When the sun began to lower over the rooftops of Rome, the character of the city slowly changed. The busiest work of the day faded. Markets closed their stalls. Shops pulled wooden shutters across their doors. The crowds that had filled the streets during the afternoon gradually thinned. But the city did not become silent. Instead, a slower kind of activity appeared. People left their homes to visit bathhouses, one of the most important social spaces in Roman daily life. Bathhouses were not only about washing. They were places of conversation, relaxation, and routine. Visitors followed a sequence of rooms. First came the apoditerium, where clothing was removed and stored. Then the tepidarium, a warm room where people began to relax and adjust to the heat. Next the caldarium, the hot bath itself, filled with steam and warm water. And finally the frigidarium, a cool pool where bathers refreshed themselves before leaving. Moving slowly through these rooms allowed the body to unwind after a long day. But equally important was the social atmosphere. Friends talked while sitting beside the pools. Business discussions continued quietly. Neighbors exchanged stories about the events of the day. Bathhouses were one of the few places where different social classes sometimes shared the same space. For many Romans, visiting the baths was part of their daily routine, almost as regular as eating dinner. Modern societies still maintain similar habits. Gyms, spas, and swimming pools often serve as places where people relax and socialize. The buildings may look different. But the idea of ending the day by unwinding in warm water feels timeless. After the baths, many Romans returned home for the evening meal. As mentioned earlier, dinner could last for hours. Candles and oil lamps illuminated the room with soft golden light. Guests reclined comfortably while servants brought dishes one at a time. Conversation moved easily from topic to topic. Some guests told humorous stories. Others debated politics or philosophy. Musicians might perform quietly in the background. For wealthy households, dinner parties could become elaborate displays of hospitality. But even simple meals carried a sense of ritual. Sharing food created connection. It marked the transition from the busy hours of work into the slower pace of evening. And after dinner, the city gradually drifted towards sleep. Night in Rome looked very different from night in a modern city. There were no electric streetlights. Only small oil lamps glowed in windows or at doorways. The streets became darker. Quieter. Yet not completely empty. Night watchmen walked through neighborhoods keeping an eye out for fires or disturbances. Occasional travelers moved carefully through narrow streets. Sometimes the distant sound of voices drifted through the darkness. But compared to the crowded daytime city, night felt calm. Many Romans went to bed relatively early. Without bright artificial lighting, staying awake late required extra effort. People relied on sunrise to begin their activities. So the night often became a time for rest. Inside homes, families settled into simple sleeping arrangements. Beds were usually wooden frames topped with woven cords or straw mattresses. Blankets provided warmth during cooler nights. Rooms remained quiet except for the soft flicker of oil lamps before they were finally extinguished. And slowly, the entire city rested. Another interesting aspect of Roman life was their relationship with luck and superstition. Romans were practical people in many ways, but they also believed strongly in signs and omens. Small rituals helped them feel prepared for uncertainty. Some Romans carried lucky charms. Others consulted fortune tellers before important decisions. Bird movements, unusual dreams, or strange natural events sometimes appeared to hold hidden meaning. Before major battles or political actions, officials occasionally consulted religious specialists to interpret signs from the gods. These rituals may seem mysterious to modern observers. But the underlying emotion is familiar. Humans naturally look for patterns. When events feel uncertain, people often search for symbols that suggest what might happen next. Modern society still contains many small superstitions. Athletes follow lucky routines before competitions. Travelers sometimes choose particular seats or numbers they consider fortunate. People cross their fingers, knock on wood, or carry symbolic objects. These habits may not control events, but they provide comfort. Rome simply expressed this instinct through its own cultural traditions. Communication in Roman society also required patience. Without phones or digital messages, most communication happened face-to-face or through handwritten letters. Messengers carried letters between cities. Travel time determined how quickly news could spread. Sometimes weeks passed before a message reached its destination. Yet letters played an important role in maintaining relationships. Roman writers described everyday events, shared personal thoughts, and discussed political developments. These letters preserved voices from the ancient world. Reading them today feels surprisingly intimate. The writers talk about daily concerns that sound familiar even now. Family matters. Friendships. Work frustrations. Travel stories. Life's small triumphs and disappointments. Modern communication moves far faster. Messages arrive instantly. But the desire to stay connected through written words has not changed. Rome simply practiced it with ink, parchment, and patience. And so the quiet rhythm of Roman life continues gently forward. Morning routines. Busy streets. Shared meals. Evening conversations. Nighttime rest. These patterns repeated day after day, year after year, across one of the largest cities the ancient world had ever known. And in those routines, something powerful developed. Stability. Because when millions of people follow similar rhythms, society begins to function smoothly. Markets open when customers arrive. Courts operate during predictable hours. Bathhouses welcome visitors at the same time each day. Meals mark the transition from work to rest. Routine builds trust. People know what to expect. Life feels organized. Rome valued this stability. It allowed an enormous empire to operate despite its vast size and diverse population. And even today, modern cities still depend on similar rhythms. Morning commutes. Lunch breaks. Evening gatherings. Nighttime rest. The details may have changed. But the quiet patterns remain. So as our slow journey through Roman habits continues deep into the peaceful hours of the night, we are reminded of something simple. History is not only made by emperors and armies. It is made by ordinary people living ordinary days. Walking to work. Sharing food. Talking with neighbors. Following routines that bring order to daily life. Rome was filled with these moments. Millions of them. And together they created a civilization whose influence still reaches across centuries. Even now, long after its marble buildings have weathered and its language has evolved, the rhythms of Roman life quietly echo through the modern world. Softly. Almost unnoticed. But still present. Just as steady and enduring as the slow turning of time itself. As our slow walk through the rhythms of Roman life continues, we can notice another quiet part of daily existence that often goes unnoticed in history books. Animals. Animals were everywhere in the Roman world. Some served practical purposes. Others were companions. And many simply lived alongside people as part of the natural environment of the city and countryside. Horses were among the most important animals in Roman society. They pulled carts, carried riders across long distances, and played a central role in chariot racing. On Roman roads outside the city, travelers frequently passed riders moving between towns or military posts. Inside the city, horses moved more carefully through narrow streets. The sound of hooves striking stone pavement became part of Rome's daily soundtrack. Donkeys and mules were also extremely common. These hard-working animals carried heavy loads through busy markets or hauled goods between farms and cities. Merchants relied on them to transport products like grain, wine, olive oil, and pottery. Without these animals, trade would have been far more difficult. In the countryside, animals formed the backbone of agriculture. Oxen pulled plows through fields. Sheep and goats provided wool and milk. Chickens wandered through farmyards searching for seeds and insects. Life moved in harmony with these animals, each species contributing in small ways to the rhythm of daily survival. But animals were not only workers. Some Romans kept pets. Small dogs were especially popular companions. They guarded homes, barked at strangers, and followed their owners through courtyards and gardens. Archaeologists have even discovered mosaics at Roman house entrances showing dogs beside the famous warning, Cave Canem, meaning, beware of the dog. Cats also existed in the Roman world, though they became more common in later centuries. They helped control rodents and sometimes became affectionate companions. Birds were occasionally kept as pets too. Parrots and songbirds brought color and sound into Roman homes. Even today, animals continue to share human environments in similar ways. Dogs guard houses and provide companionship. Cats lounge comfortably in quiet corners. Horses still carry riders across countryside trails. Animals remain woven into human life just as they were in ancient Rome. Another element of Roman daily life that shaped people's experiences was the weather. Without modern heating, cooling, or weather forecasting, Romans lived closely connected to natural conditions. Hot summers could make the city streets feel overwhelming. Stone buildings absorbed heat throughout the day, releasing warmth slowly during the evening. To escape the midday sun, many Romans rested indoors during the hottest hours. This natural pause in activity resembled what many Mediterranean cultures still practice today. Afternoons slowed down. People waited until cooler hours before returning to work or social life. Winter in Rome was milder than in northern Europe, but cold winds and rain still arrived during certain months. Homes relied on braziers, small containers filled with burning charcoal, to provide warmth. Families gathered near these heat sources while talking, eating, or preparing for sleep. Rain sometimes turned streets muddy. Storms delayed travel. But most Romans simply adapted. Weather was accepted as part of life's natural rhythm. Today, modern technology shields people from many weather challenges. Air conditioning cools buildings. Central heating warms homes. Weather forecasts predict storms days in advance. Yet despite these comforts, weather still influences daily routines. Rain delays travel. Snow closes schools. Hot days encourage slower schedules. In this way, modern life remains connected to the same environmental forces that shaped Roman routines thousands of years ago. Health and medicine formed another quiet but important part of Roman society. Roman doctors practiced a mixture of observation, tradition, and inherited knowledge from earlier civilizations, especially Greece. They studied the human body carefully. They believed health depended on balance. Diet, exercise, sleep, and emotional stability all played roles in maintaining wellness. Doctors sometimes prescribed herbal remedies made from plants. Certain herbs were believed to reduce pain, calm the stomach, or promote healing. Other treatments involved rest, massage, or bathing in mineral-rich waters. Roman bathhouses themselves were sometimes considered beneficial for health. Warm baths relaxed muscles. Steam cleared breathing passages. Cold plunges refreshed the body. Medical knowledge in ancient times was limited compared to modern science, but Roman physicians still worked seriously to understand illness and treatment. Some even performed surgical procedures using carefully designed tools. Modern medicine has advanced enormously. Hospitals, vaccines, antibiotics, and advanced surgical techniques have transformed healthcare. Yet many Roman ideas about health still sound familiar. Balanced diet. Regular exercise. Adequate rest. Stress reduction. These recommendations appear in modern medical advice as well. It seems that even thousands of years ago, people already understood that maintaining health required careful attention to everyday habits. Exercise was another valued part of Roman life. While some people worked physically demanding jobs that provided plenty of activity, others intentionally practiced exercise for strength and fitness. Bathhouses often included exercise courtyards called palaestri. Here, citizens performed simple physical activities before bathing. They wrestled. They threw balls. They practiced running or stretching. These exercises improved strength and endurance. Athletic training was also important for soldiers. Roman legions depended on physical discipline. Soldiers marched long distances carrying heavy equipment. They practiced combat drills repeatedly to maintain readiness. Physical conditioning allowed the Roman military to operate effectively across vast territories. Even today, exercise remains a key part of healthy living. People visit gyms. They run in parks. They practice yoga, swimming, or strength training. The environments have changed, but the human body still benefits from movement. Rome understood that physical strength supported both individual health and collective success. Music and street performance added another layer to the soundscape of Roman cities. Musicians played instruments such as flutes, lyres, and drums. Performers entertained crowds during festivals, banquets, and public gatherings. In busy marketplaces, traveling entertainers sometimes stopped to perform tricks, tell stories, or play lively melodies. These performers attracted small groups of curious listeners. Coins might drop into a small bowl as appreciation. Street entertainment provided brief moments of joy during ordinary days. Modern cities continue this tradition. Street musicians play guitars, violins, or drums in public squares. Artists perform magic tricks or acrobatics. Passers-by pause for a moment before continuing their journeys. Entertainment in public spaces helps cities feel alive. Rome understood this well. Music and performance brought energy into everyday environments. And so, as the quiet hours continue slipping gently past, the world of ancient Rome becomes clearer in the mind. A city filled with people waking early and walking busy streets. Animals carrying goods through markets. Farmers tending fields beyond the city walls. Doctors offering advice for health. Children learning their first letters. Musicians filling the air with simple melodies. Families sharing evening meals. Neighbors exchanging stories beneath the soft light of oil lamps. These moments rarely appear in dramatic history books. But they form the true texture of life. Millions of small experiences repeating across generations. And through those quiet patterns, Roman civilization slowly shaped ideas that continue influencing the modern world. Habits passed forward. Practices repeated. Rhythms that feel almost timeless. And now, as the night grows deeper and calmer, those ancient rhythms fade softly into the background once again. Not as distant history, but as a gentle reminder that the ordinary moments of human life have always been surprisingly similar. Across centuries. Across cultures. Across time itself.